Hello friends, today we are going to discuss the topic of nose and paranasal sinuses. Okay, so now before we go and discuss the anatomy of nose, let us talk a little bit about these paranasal sinuses. So what do we mean by paranasal sinuses? Now we know that the sinus means an empty space. Okay, so this is an empty space, or you can say this is a air filled space, right, around the nasal cavity. So para means around the nasal cavity. So we have paranasal sinuses. Okay, so let's look at these paranasal sinuses. Now, how many paranasal sinuses do we have? Let's look in this photograph. We can see the number one over here. That's the maxillary sinus. Above the maxillary sinus, we can see over here are the ethmoid sinuses. Okay, so these are group of air cells known as ethmoid sinus, and above that we can see the frontal sinus, right? Okay, now if you take a cross section of the face, you can see all these three sinuses in the cross section also, the maxillary, the ethmoid and the frontal sinus. Other than that, posteriorly you can see another sinus right in the center, that is known as sphenoid sinus. Okay, so these are four pairs of paranasal sinuses, four on each side: maxillary, ethmoid, frontal and sphenoid. Okay, and we will discuss each one of them one by one. So let's first start with the maxillary sinus. Now the maxillary sinus lies in the maxillary bone. And as you can see over here that this maxilla, this is a paired bone. So we have two bones of maxilla, one on each side. This is a paired bone, the maxillary bone. Now inside the maxillary bone, you can see that there is a air-filled cavity, and that is known as maxillary sinus. Right? So remember, first thing, the maxillary sinus, this sinus is the first to develop. Okay, so this is the sinus which is first to develop embryologically. It starts developing at 3 months, that is 12 weeks of intrauterine life. Okay, so it starts developing at 12 weeks of intrauterine life, or 3 months of intrauterine life. Now this sinus, that means this sinus is present at birth. Obviously, okay, so it is present at birth, and this sinus can be seen on a plain X-ray by 4 to 5 months of age. Okay, so 4 to 5 months after birth, you can see this sinus on a plain X-ray also. Of course, if I do CT scan, this sinus is present at birth, so therefore I can also see it on CT scan at birth. But we rarely do CT scan at birth. Okay, if we do a plain X-ray, we can see it at 4 to 5 months after birth. Now this maxillary sinus, this keeps on growing and it reaches adult size by 15 to 18 years of age. Right? So it reaches adult size by 15 to 18 years of age. Now remember, this maxillary sinus, this is the largest paranasal sinus. This is the largest paranasal sinus. Its adult volume is 15 ml. Okay, so 15 ml is the approximate adult volume of this sinus. Right? Okay, now because it's the biggest sinus, and this sinus, you see, it is one big cell, single cell, so it is also named as maxillary antrum. So it has been also named as maxillary antrum, and we also call it as antrum of Highmore. So very easy to remember, antrum of Highmore. You see, this is the largest sinus. This is the first to develop. So high and more, both the words are used over here. So antrum of Highmore or maxillary antrum. All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about it later when we go into the in-depth anatomy, but this was an overview for the maxillary sinus. Let's go to the next sinus, and the next sinus is the ethmoid sinus. Right, so before we discuss the ethmoid sinus, let's have a look at the ethmoid bone. So this in front of you is the ethmoid bone, and remember, the ethmoid bone is an unpaired bone. Right, so in the skull, this is an unpaired bone. And what we look in this ethmoid bone, we can see over here that right in the center we have the perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone. Now this perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone, it goes in the nasal septum and forms a part of it. Right, so we have the perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone. Remember, it divides the nose into two nasal cavities, right and left. Now this perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone, it extends upwards in the cranial cavity, also in the anterior cranial fossa, and there it is known as crista galli. All right, okay, now on the sides of the crista galli, we have the cribriform plate of ethmoid bone that forms the roof of the nasal cavity. Okay, so remember, this forms the roof of nasal cavity. Also, another important thing about cribriform plate, this is the thinnest bone in the body. Okay, cribriform plate of ethmoid, this is the thinnest bone in body. Right, now on the two sides of this cribriform plate, you can see that there is a group of air cells. So you can see over here, there is a group of air cells. Now what are they forming? Number one, you can see that there is formation of middle turbinate and there is formation of superior turbinate. What else is this forming? It is forming over here the lateral wall of the orbit. Okay, that's known as orbital plate, and this is a very thin plate. This is the thinnest wall of the orbit. So this is the thinnest wall of the orbit. It is like paper thin, therefore it is also known as lamina papyracea. Okay, so this orbital plate formed by the ethmoid bone, this is the lateral wall of the ethmoid, or you can say it is the medial wall of the orbit, and this is known as lamina papyracea because it is papery thin. Okay, so this was the ethmoid bone. Now let's have a look at the ethmoid bone from above. Okay, so from inside the cranial cavity, when we look at this ethmoid bone, this is how it looks like. Now once again, in this you can identify the crista galli, and around the crista galli on both the sides you can see the cribriform plate. Okay, and you can see that lateral to cribriform plate we have a group of air cells, and these we call as ethmoid sinuses. Okay, together known as ethmoid sinuses, and lateral to that we have the orbital plate or the lamina papyracea, which forms the medial wall of the orbit. Okay, remember, cribriform plate is the thinnest bone in the body. However, lamina papyracea is the thinnest wall of the orbit. Right? Okay. Now that was the ethmoid bone and the ethmoid sinuses. Now let's remember something more about the ethmoid sinuses development. Now these ethmoid sinuses, they also start developing before birth in the intrauterine life. Okay, so they start developing in the intrauterine life. So that means they are also present at birth. So if I do a CT scan Will they be present in the CT scan at birth? Yes, they will be present in CT scan at birth. Okay, when can I see them on a plain X-ray? I can see them on a plain X-ray by 1 year of age. Okay, so by 1 year of age, you can see them on a plain X-ray. All right, now the next question is, when do they reach adult size? So these ethmoid sinuses, they reach adult size by approximately 12 years of age. Remember, these are very small cells, so they don't have to grow much. Unlike the maxillary sinus, they don't have to grow much. So they reach adult size quickly, that is by 12 years of age. Okay, so we'll talk more about these ethmoid sinuses later on. Just remember one more thing, that these ethmoid sinuses, they are divided into two groups. These are known as anterior group and posterior group. So we have anterior ethmoids and posterior ethmoids, and this classification we will discuss more in the anatomy of nose and paranasal sinuses. Okay, so let's go to the next sinus, and the next sinus to develop is the sphenoid sinus. So let's have a look at the sphenoid bone. So what we can see over here is the sphenoid bone. We can see this revolving sphenoid bone. So I will be teaching you the sphenoid bone later on in detail in the anatomy, but we should know that this central part of the sphenoid bone, that's known as sphenoid body, and in this sphenoid body develops the sphenoid sinus. Okay, so once again remember, the sphenoid bone, this is a unpaired bone. Okay, the sphenoid bone is an unpaired bone. Now in the center of the sphenoid bone we have the body, and this body undergoes pneumatization to form the sphenoid sinus. Okay, so now you will say that there is only one body. Okay, so what happens? In this sphenoid sinus, there is a septa. This is known as intersinus septum. Okay, so in the sphenoid sinus, there is the intersinus septum, and this intersinus septum divides this pneumatized cavity into two parts, the right and the left, and therefore we have two sphenoid sinuses, right and the left sphenoid sinus. Okay, so there is one bone known as sphenoid bone. It's an unpaired bone. Okay, but we have two sinuses, two sphenoid sinuses, right and left. That is because of the intersinus septum. Okay, now this sphenoid sinus, when does it starts developing? Now remember, at the time of birth, this sphenoid sinus, it is present as a small cavity. Okay, it is present as a very small cavity. Now you can see this cavity in CT scan also, right? However, the main pneumatization in the body, it starts around 2 years of age. Okay, so the main pneumatization starts around 2 years of age. So yes, this sinus is also present at birth. Okay, we can see it on a CT scan also. Now when can we see this on a plain X-ray? Okay, now you see, we saw in the first photograph, the sphenoid sinus is a air-filled cavity that is in the center of the skull. Now this cavity has to grow big in size so that it is clearly visible in a plain X-ray. So it will take time. Okay, and this sinus is therefore visible on a plain X-ray by 6 to 7 years of age. Right? And the next question, when does this sinus reaches adult size? So it reaches adult size by approximately 15 years of age. Right? Okay, so that was a little bit about the sphenoid sinus. Let's go and see the frontal sinus. So the frontal sinus, it obviously lies in the frontal bone. As you can see over here, this is the frontal bone and this is also a unpaired bone. Okay, so this also you can see, this is the unpaired bone. And you can see over here that this part of the frontal bone, it is forming the superior wall of the orbit. Okay, so the orbital plate of the frontal bone, it forms the superior wall of orbit. And that plate of bone is nematized. Okay, and it undergoes nematization to form the frontal sinus. Once again, this nematized cavity is divided by an intersinus septum. Okay, so once again we have an intersinus septum, and because of that the frontal sinus is divided into two cavities, right frontal sinus and left frontal sinus. Okay, right? So again we have a paired frontal sinus despite the fact that we have only one frontal bone. Now, when does the frontal sinus starts developing? Now listen carefully, because this is a new development which is given wrongly in the undergraduate textbooks, or others I'll say they have not been updated. So as per the new Scott Brown and the new latest editions of Gray's Anatomy, the frontal sinus is also present at birth as a small cavity. Okay, however, this frontal sinus at the time of birth, it is indistinguishable from anterior ethmoids. So you cannot differentiate them separately. Okay, you cannot differentiate the frontal sinus from the anterior ethmoids. Okay, therefore you cannot see it on a CT scan. You cannot distinguish them. That means you are trying to see them by a CT scan, but you cannot see it on a CT scan. Okay, earliest you can see the frontal sinus on a CT scan is by 1 year of age. That is the earliest you can see. Right? Okay, so remember, the frontal sinus is present as a small cavity at the time of birth. Okay, and the main nematization in this frontal sinus it starts after 2 years of age. So previously it was thought that it forms after 2 years, but we know that there is a small cavity present at birth. However, the main nematization, the main cavity formation or the sinus formation starts after 2 years of age. Right? Okay, so very important. Now, that means all the 4 sinuses are present at birth. Okay, however, we cannot see the frontal sinus in CT scan at birth. We can see it only by 1 year of age. Why 1 year? The frontal sinus is not undergoing nematization, because by 1 year these anterior ethmoids, they grow Okay, and now you can separately distinguish them from the frontal sinus. Okay, so remember, the frontal may not be growing at 1 year, but anterior ethmoids are growing, so that is why you are able to differentiate them from the frontal sinus. Okay, so frontal sinus is present at birth. Okay, now the next question about frontal sinus is, when does the frontal sinus become visible on a plain X-ray? Okay, now this is also very important. You see, this frontal sinus, the growth starts mainly after 2 years of age, right? But this sinus is very superficial, right? So therefore, when it crosses this brow line, as soon as it grows above this brow line over here, okay, so it grows above the brow line, we will be able to see it. So it crosses the brow line by 4 years of age. So that means the frontal sinus will be visible on a plain X-ray by 4 to 5 years of age. So around this age, the frontal sinus starts becoming visible on a plain X-ray. Now remember, this is the sinus that is the last to start developing, okay, and it is also the last to reach adult size. So it reaches adult size by approximately 18 years of age. So by 18 years, we all become adults, okay, so that is the early adulthood of a person, and a person is able to drink, a person is able to vote, a person is allowed to drive. So that is the frontal sinus. It reaches adult size by around 18 years of age. Okay, so the person does not remain a juvenile at 18 years, becomes an adult. Okay, now before we go ahead, let's discuss the development of paranasal sinuses. So what all we have just discussed, I have just tabulated them in this table for a quick recap and remembering the important MCQs. Okay, so now first thing, maxillary sinus, you see all the 4 sinuses over here, you can see they are all present at birth. So this question used to be asked earlier, that which of the following sinuses is not present at birth? And that's an old question. We knew the answer was frontal sinus, because at that time it was thought that the frontal sinus is not present, it is not developed by birth. But we now know that's a false statement. Okay, however, we can modify the question and give it now. How can we give the question now? We can give the question now as, which of the following sinuses is not present in a CT scan at birth? Okay, or which of the following sinus is not seen in CT scan at birth? So we know we are not able to differentiate the frontal sinus on a CT scan at birth. On CT scan, we can see the frontal sinus clearly only by 1 year of age. So yes, we can modify this question and we can still give it to you. Okay. Now the first X-ray appearance for maxillary sinus we discussed was 4 to 5 months. Ethmoid was 1 year. Sphenoid we know is 6 to 7 years, and frontal we have discussed is 4 to 5 years. Now remember that this frontal sinus and sphenoid sinus is given incorrect in many undergraduate textbooks. So as I have explained to you that the sphenoid sinus is quite in the depth, okay, it is in the center of the skull, so it will take time to appear on a plain X-ray. Frontal, however, is superficial, okay, and also this, as soon as it crosses the brow line, there is no important structure there that will interfere with the imaging of this frontal sinus, so we can quickly see it after 4 years of age. Okay, now this information is given incorrect in many undergraduate textbooks, so I am highlighting that please remember the correct information. Okay, adult size also we have discussed. Maxillary sinus 15 to 18 years, ethmoid 12 years, sphenoid 15 years, and frontal 18 years when we reach adulthood. Okay, so early adulthood, the 18 years, that is for frontal sinus. Okay, now before we go ahead, let's do a few MCQs which have been asked in the different exams. So first question is, we have just discussed which of the following sinus grows till early adulthood, and this was asked in the AIMS November 2017 exam, and we now know that the answer is frontal sinus, grows till 18 years of age. Okay, the next question that we can see, X-ray appearances of paranasal sinuses according to years is. So we can see the ethmoid 1 year, that is a correct statement. Frontal appears by 4 years, that is also a correct statement. Maxillary 4 to 6 months, yes, 5 to 6 months, 4 to 6 months, that's a correct statement. And sphenoid 7 years, 6 to 7 years, yes, so that is also a correct statement. So all of these are correct. Okay, this was asked in the FMG June 2018 exam. So you see that these questions are asked regularly in the exam, right?